mě slyšet? Jo, je mě slyšet. Dobrý den, srdečně vás.
Good afternoon, welcome. In this panel, we are going to speak in English, but we are going to speak English, but there is translation provided. So, let's start.
Difference is us and them. And the topic of this debate is a divided Europe. This title, A Divided Europe, as I think, has two different meanings. First of all, it's about the Europe or European Union or European community that has not a common stance, positions towards many problems. And only one of these problems is war in Ukraine. But the second meaning of this topic, a divided Europe, is the problem that the part of Europe, I mean Russia, it seems that it doesn't want to be a part of Europe anymore. It doesn't want to integrate with democratic, capitalist, European system. And my first question would be to Robert Cooper, who is a well-known British author and a British diplomat, of course, but he's a writer as well. And I would like to quote just a few sentences from an article, from an essay, which he wrote for Aspen Review, quarterly, which I'm an editor-in-chief, by the way. It goes like this. It turns out that the Russian state doesn't need to join this world. Russian state, like Saudi Arabia's, is founded by revenue from natural resources, and it doesn't need to be a part of the capitalist democratic world. The dominant mode of thought in the Russian state is pre-capitalist exploitation of natural resources. Is pre-capitalist. Exploitation of natural resources is a form of conquest. You tear wealth from the earth as from the hands of your enemies. In such countries, revenue is collected from exported resources. Taxation and their democracy are less necessary. The idea of empire can still be rational for a country that functions in this way. I'm sorry, I lost my glasses. I left my glasses at the hotel. So the question to you is about Russia as a part of Europe. Is it part of Europe or not?
Well, Europe is the rest of Europe is post-imperial. Almost all European countries at some point, I bet even Slovakia, if you think back far enough, almost all of them had empires in some ways. But at least for Western Europe, and after all, it's not so long ago. At the beginning of the 20th century, the world was divided into British Empire, French Empire. There was still something left of Dutch Empire. Germans owned a few bits and pieces here. Well, it was called an empire then. There's bad translation of Reich, actually. But the world was a world of empires, and there was a Russian Empire, and the rest. The Western Europe, at any rate, is post-imperial. Other parts of Europe are ex-imperial in a different way, in that they were victims of empire rather than, but we are all one way or another post-imperial, whereas I don't think that this is, I hoped at one point that this was going to be true of Russia as well, that they would have learned that it doesn't work. The real lesson, and by the way, this is the lesson that you see, it's the most amazing story that a half-baked second-rate country like Iraq can bring America down. Or the other great story of the century is of when Woodrow Wilson was in Paris for the Versailles Conference, one of the kitchen workers in the Ritz sent him a letter saying, I like your doctrine of self-determination, can my country have it please? His name was Ho Chi Minh, and it took a long time. But the story of the 20th century is the story of the end of imperialism, and it's the story, although this story began long ago, it's the story of wealth increasing not through theft, but through trade. That's the story of the Netherlands, which after all beat Spain, which was the great power of the 17th century. And with that, with trade, you need a different kind of civilization. You need a civilization which is based on law and equality, and also on taxation. And with taxation comes representation. The slogan in America was no taxation without representation. It works the other way around. There is no representation without taxation. Oliver Wendell Holmes, the great American judge, used to say, I like paying my taxes, it's my contribution to civilization. Civilization is created by the state, and you have to pay for it. I don't think that was the question you asked.
Who cares? It was interesting and it was good. Vasil, I would like to ask you now, because you've got this, experience of being the most closest neighbor of all of us, neighbor of Russia. What is your position towards Russia's Europeanness, I would say?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the question and for having invited me here. It's like a big privilege to speak at the forum in front of such public. I think that, at least from my perspective as a Ukrainian, what we see now from the Russian side is the politics which is based on resentment. Maybe the EU as a collective body doesn't pay attention enough to this dimension, but still, as far as we can see from Ukraine, it's the strategy which is based on the idea that I am strong only because I am destroying something else. First, destroying civic society in Russia, then making Ukrainian state down as an answer to the Ukrainian revolution, is Putin's counter-revolution. And then, as far as I can see, it's to make the EU down, because EU has a beginning and it can come to an end. And maybe it will take even not decades but years, because the idea is that Russian power can be really a big power only when you have not the EU but competing states between each other. So that is a recipe that Russia is imposing on the post-Soviet space, and somehow Europe is challenged by it. It is challenged by war, which emerged as an answer to Maidan, to Ukrainian revolution. And somehow it's Europe in general is pretty acquainted with such a notion and concept and practice as war. Historically it was structured by wars, but I think it's maybe at least during last decades for the first time when you have anti-European war, more or less clear that Ukrainian state to take Donbass, to take Crimea is only part of the bigger strategy, part of a bigger disintegration effort which is aimed at the EU. We were joking that when Europe took a position, Russia took Crimea. So Europe is not ready enough, doesn't know appropriate instruments how to react. And that's why somehow we are speaking about divided Europe, because and celebrating the 25th anniversary of the Velvet Revolutions, but still the problem is that the European politics in general is still based on the idea of the wall. So, to put it metaphorically, and even for the Ukrainians it's not a metaphor, the Berlin Wall didn't fall, it just gained another form. It was moved to the east, and now it's more or less goes on the Polish-Ukrainian border. And during all these years, after '89, and especially after the crash of the Soviet Union, Ukraine as a state was functioning like a buffer zone for the EU. It created a pretty big privilege for the EU not to have a common border with Russia, which is actually the longest border in Europe between Ukraine and Russia. And of course, Europe is always deeply concerned, but still you can have like a gray zone, which was called Eastern Neighborhood. But anyway, you are out, you are just a neighbor, you are not in, you are in transition. So on one hand, it's I would say a betrayal of the '89 declaration, which was actually aimed at overcoming of historical division of Europe and overcoming of the political isolation of the Eastern Europe. It was not. It didn't become true, and Ukraine proved something different. Ukraine politically is now much more ahead than Europe, because Europe is challenged not only by war, it's challenged also by Maidan, which was profoundly European, much more European actually than the EU itself. So Europe has to be transformed. It is interpolated by revolution and by war, and now it has to choose. But anyway, this challenge is that we need another Europe, not a divided one. And so it's now the ball is on your side. I mean the European one, because I'm speaking like on the other side of the wall.
Thank you. Yeah, can you hear me? Okay. Vasil, I didn't introduce you, but all of you know who Vasil is. He's a social activist from Ukraine, from Kiev, and the leader of Ukrainian Krytyka Polityczna. Am I right?
Yeah, not only.
Okay, not only. Ivan Krastev. I don't have to introduce you as well. But I would like... Okay, so I will not introduce you because everybody knows who Ivan Krastev is. Okay? So my question is why we are not ready to respond to the problems we face.
There was a German kind of philosopher from 1930s which didn't behave very decently then, but he said something very important. I mean Carl Schmitt. He said, "Victors feels no curiosity." And this is what happened to the West after the end of the Cold War. We knew all the answers before the questions being asked. And we have been so much basically trying to celebrate some real achievements that now we're basically surprised by everything that happens. Now people like to talk a lot about Cold War and so on. Listen, during the Cold War, the Soviet Union and the West have been competing who can offer a better model for the future. Now the competition between Russia and the West is who lives in the real world. Mrs. Merkel talks to Mr. Putin. She said he's not living in the real world. Mr. Putin is also absolutely sure that Europeans do not live in the real world. So basically everybody tries to convince the other what the reality is. And it's a very different exercise because there is no kind of a future dimension in this. I'm saying this because what I'll try to do answering your question is just to try to give you 4 arguments why Europeans were so surprised by the annexation of Crimea. And I do believe all of us have been. Even somebody who have been very critical towards Mr. Putin and so on, the annexation of Crimea was something that nobody expected, or almost nobody. First, is because we had a very kind of a romantic vision of the European order that came after 1989. I'm very happy that Robert Cooper is here because I do believe he did one of the best description of this and said something very important. It was European order. It was not world order. Europe was very distinctive. We were talking about shared sovereignties, mutual interference, economic interdependence. But this was not the way others have been living. This is why, by the way, the Chinese, Indians and others cannot relate to us. For them, the Ukrainian crisis is a local European crisis. They don't care. They're going to profit from us. They're going to profit from the Russians. They don't believe it has anything to do with the global order in the way they understand it. But secondly, we convinced ourselves very much that everything that is happening is a win-win game. From the point of view of the Russians, it was not a win-win game. By the way, there is nothing worse than being a loser in the world what was proclaimed to be a world without losers. One of the problems of the Europeans is that we lost the perspective that they are losers, by the way, within our own societies also. The idea is everybody is winner, some are going to win today, others are going to win tomorrow. And the second thing was, we have been so much about the objectivation of strength and power. You go with the GDP, for example. Listen, European Union is a big economic power, and Russia is not. European Union is spending even more on defense than Russia. But do you know where is the bad news? There was a Harvard study being done about the wars, asymmetrical wars, between strong powers and weak powers in the last 200 years. And it showed that if in the period 18 to 1850, only in the 12% of the times, weak power can achieve its strategic objectives when basically facing a stronger power, in the last 50 years, in 55% of the cases, weak power is prevailing over the strong power. Because it's also about commitment, for whom it is more important. Iraq and Afghanistan is a classical example. The United States are much stronger than any of them, but it does not mean that they can basically achieve their strategic objective. And the third thing which I find quite important was that European Union, we have a perception of ourselves that we are so kind of noble but also vegetarian that nobody can really be felt threatened by us. As a result, when basically the Russians said we are threatened by this and that, we managed to convince ourselves that they really fear Chinese and they really fear radical Islam, but they don't care about us. I'm saying this because in a certain way, the major problem that we face about Europe today is to try to reimagine the world in which we're living, but in a way to basically preserve what we have achieved, not simply basically to surrender. I'm going to end up telling you a film, which in my view tells more about Russia than most of our analysis. It's an old film, old, before this crisis. It's 2007 film by Mr. Nikita Mikhalkov, well known, very kind of close to Mr. Putin, but culturally and ideologically close, it's not simply there. But the film is called 12. I don't know as anybody of you watching it. It's a remake by a famous American film, 12 Angry Men. 12 Angry Men is an American classic from 1957. This is really one of the strongest defense ever of liberalism. It came after McCarthy's stage. And this is the story of a jury of 12 men that should decide on the fate of a boy who is accused of killing somebody. The boy is a Puerto Rican boy. The evidence looked very clear. Everybody wants all this to finish in minutes. 11 people are convinced that he is the killer, and there was one guy who starts asking questions. And the whole film, American Classics, is about this guy asking questions, and over 2 hours, on the basis of arguments and evidence, all 12 reached the conclusion that the guy is innocent, and he was freed. Here's the Russian version. The same story, a Chechen boy being accused of murder. There are jurors going there. There is one who asks the questions. And after 2 hours, all of them are convinced that he was not the murderer, that he was framed, and here's the moment when they should free him. This is how the American film ends. And then there is a character who very much resembles Mr. Putin, and who basically is played by Nikita Mikhalkov himself, who said, listen, stop here. Yes, he is innocent, but I'm not sure that we should free him from prison, because if we free him from prison, he is going to be killed. Because the people who freed him are going to kill him. So now you have 2 options, either to keep him in prison or somebody to adopt the boy and take care of himself. This is the story of Russian faces globalization. Russian elites believe that the country and the society cannot be freed. They either should be kept in prison or adopted, and the only one who basically declared that he is ready to invest in adopting was this former ex-KGB officer, played by Mikhalkov. And I do believe that it's very important to try, when we're talking about Russia's behavior, to try to understand that there is something very important and close between Russia's behavior and the behavior of some of the populist parties that we have in our own countries. This is very much about hypocrisy of this Western world they don't understand, fear of this opening which they cannot control, and as a result of it, basically the only way is to challenge the system in the way it is without having the alternative to the system. And this is why for me this us versus them, it functions on 2 levels. The us are the elites in many of our societies. For Russians, the elites is the other kind of name of the West.
Thank you a lot. As you all remember, one of the actors in this famous American film that Ivan mentioned was a Czech actor, Visegrád. So we came to Central European aspect of the discussion, of this debate, and I would like to ask Ivan Gabal, Czech sociologist and Czech politician, the member of the parliament, to explain us why Central European elites, societies, states, countries also do not have a common stance towards Russia, towards Russian aggression on Ukraine, towards Ukrainian aspirations, let's say European aspirations, and so on, and so on, and so on. What the hell is the problem with Central Europe, Ivan?
Okay, thank you, and thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here in Bratislava, and I'm sorry to speak English, but it's a rule here. I would start with a simple answer to Vasil. There is an enormous debate going in the Czech political environment what we should do as far as the Ukraine crisis. The reason is simple. We perceive it as a most significant change of strategic environment in our region since 1989. And we debate what sort of reaction we need to develop. I had yesterday on a Committee of Defense meeting with several people on defense from ministries and others. I will say a few points later, but let me start first with I would say slide by significant disagreement with Ivan Krastev, because what does it mean change of strategic environment? We experienced unprecedented 25 years of security and prosperity in this region, which was developed by our strong contribution due to dismantling Warsaw Pact, pushing Soviet troops out from the region, giving chance to traditional European countries to decline defense spending so significantly that the huge increase of revenues opened room for establishment of larger, deeper EU and Euro. Euro wouldn't happen without decline of budget spendings. And we basically helped significantly to unite Europe, to bring Germany together, and to bring significant part of former Soviet satellite into NATO first, and then legal and economic environment of EU. And it's, I would say, it's a success story because the quality of life expectancy, our opportunities, quality of education all grew up significantly. And this is due to united Europe. So I'm not going to complain about Europe from this point of view, and I'm happy we are there. However, the question is this period over or not? Our perception is, and here I would agree, that the behavior of Russia is basically conflict between rule of law and rule of ruler. And destruction of rule of law means destruction of European fundaments. Second, due to this qualitative systemic distinction, we do not expect Russia is going to stop its aggressive behavior. Contributing factor is that the United States under current administration dissociated significantly from Europe and got involved more in other geopolitical areas. And significance of the security and defense participation and political participation of the United States decline is another argument for Kremlin to continue testing what we see in all aircrafts, ships, testing constantly the defense capacity. And we expect it's going to continue. EU did not develop till now common capacity, even external action service. In case of Ukraine, it was not successful story, and EU, due to this crisis, was very much converted back into commonality of acting states, and common EU institution did not have chance and did not display strong role. NATO did start perform militarily, however, certain understanding that new member states are not going to be integrated fully according to infrastructure, according to ability to accept assistance. We have a lot of work to do by our military exercise, and we have to do a lot for our defense. For us in Czech Republic, it does mean we start increasing defense spending, definitely. We start to bring up our defense capacity and participation in NATO. We know that we need to get more deeper, a stronger cooperation in the region, mainly Slovakia, Poland, and Hungary to the level which is acceptable. At the same time, we are fully aware that Europe has also security and defense troubles with the non-state war developing in the Mediterranean and the Middle East. with all consequences for immigration. So we understand that the whole region of new EU states has to care more about our own defense capacity and ability to respond to Russia. And last but not least, we know that it's necessity to help to maximum level Ukraine to develop towards standard legal environment, civil control of military defense, and all this know-how we went through during last 25 years not very easily. So we are ready to do that, and in a moment new parliament is fully established, we will travel to Kiev just to talk with our partners about their needs. And I think that the needs are not only on terms of gas, winter, but there is a lot of systemic need for the transition. I know it's transition in a partly country just determined by war, but it's our interest to help to stabilize democratic Ukraine and do maximum. And last but not least, I know that most of people following Czech politics are now horrified by the intensity of debate and nature of debates. And I will just repeat what we say. We say it's better to have 3 or 4 foreign policies and defense policies rather than one stupid. And the other is, please look what we do and do not listen much what we say. Thank you.
Thank you a lot. Ingo Schulze, German writer, came from Berlin. What is your perspective to the problems we are talking about, please?
I have the privilege to speak in German, and I hope I can much more clearly if I speak in German. Excuse me for this inconvenience, but I try now in German. Es ist schwer zu sagen, wo man anfangen.
It is highly problematic to say where we should begin. I believe that there is a great danger in the fact that we are heading towards a state that we had known before 1989 or 1985. We are reverting to a kind of a Cold War and confrontation between the East and the West, whatever is our definition of the East. I believe that practically all our problems that we are facing today are difficult to be resolved going counter-Russian, but we have to combine our forces with Russia. Russia under Putin is a country that says that they do not want to take part, they do not want to share the European values. I am not a politologist, I am not a civic activist, but during the last 25 years I have come to the conclusion that no other country has courted Europe so much as Russia. When the Russian leader spoke before Bundestag in 2001 in German, and he mentioned Gorbachev and his efforts at building a common European house. I believe that we should focus all our efforts at reaching a conclusion, reaching a result without the use of arms. We cannot afford another war, but we must
use all our resources to reach a peaceful solution. We can do so by getting rid of the fear that we experience. I am not an expert on Russia or an expert on Ukraine, but I perceive with great intensity the mistakes that were made by the West. 3 days before Yanukovych said that there will be no signing of the association treaty, Madam Merkel said that Ukraine allegedly does not belong to the European Union and that the association treaty can only be concluded when Mrs. Tymoshenko will be released from prison. I believe that also before Commissioner Verheugen was in charge of association process with Ukraine, and he stated that unless this precondition would be made, that is, release of Mrs. Tymoshenko from prison, the result would have been different. I believe that we cannot put the things as we are the good ones on the one side and those on the other side are the bad ones. I believe that we should try to reach the conflicts by mutual efforts. And here I want to state clearly that I do not consider annexation of Crimea to be a good thing. My sympathy goes with those who tried to express their wish for better, more democratic, more human conditions at Maidan at the price of their own life. We know that an important request voiced at Maidan was that if anybody becomes a member of government, this person cannot belong among 100 richest people in the country. And this is why I was surprised by the candidature of Madam Tymoshenko, and also I was surprised by the fact that Poroshenko was able to put up his candidature. So these are some of the things that need to be reflected upon. There is a number of questions that remained unanswered, like who was doing the shooting at Maidan. What I fail to understand is why the plan that Polish, French, and German foreign ministers negotiated with the Ukrainian Prime Minister concerning new elections in May failed. I believe that if an agreement would have been reached at the time, then Ukraine perhaps would not be at war today. So there is a number of questions, and I have many more questions than answers. At any rate, I am happy to be here, and I also see that in Germany it is almost impossible to discuss the crisis in Ukraine. Quite often there are quite opposing views expressed in this regard. I can understand why people who are directly engaged in warfare and who have to decide whether they want to belong to one or the other side are in a different position than those who are not directly concerned. it is not possible to give only a yes or no answer. It is also possible to be critical of oneself. And this does not exclude seeing the other side in a critical light, but we cannot consider the other side to be only bad. This I consider to be a great mistake.
Towards the panelists, I would like ask you for the remarks to what you said, and I would like to start with you, Robert, because I know you want.
I can never stop disagreeing with people. First of all, just a couple of things. First of all, of course, Europe is always divided. It's normal that Europe is disunited. There's 28 countries, and they all disagree with each other, and that's life, isn't it? If we were not like that, then we wouldn't be European. So, no, well, that's normal. That people quarrel and disagree. Actually, I found that I disagree with myself because I was agreeing with what I was saying earlier, which was not very friendly to Russia, and then I found myself very sympathetic to what Ingo Schulz was saying just then, that one shouldn't try to classify people as good and bad. So I agree with both of those things, and it's contradictory. But I had a couple of follow-up remarks. First of all, actually, I'm a deep lover of the European Union, and maybe we ought to begin even to feel a little bit proud that Mr. Putin feels threatened by us. And I think in a way he is probably more threatened by the European Union than he is by NATO, because he understands NATO, and that's the world that he lives in and comes from, and the military world. And I think that the rule of law is probably a more threatening concept than military force. And what frightens him is the thought that just as people in Ukraine have looked across the border at Poland and seen what has happened in 25 years, maybe in 25 years' time, Russians might look across the border and see Ukraine. And that would be a threat to a Ukraine which begins to look like Poland. And that would be a threat. And that's what comes from rule of law and legitimacy and these things. And these are, in the end, more powerful than weapons. Weapons, I think, they can be dealt with Russia. But the way in which you defeat your enemies is by converting them. I have two other small remarks. First of all, one of the reasons that we should worry about Russia a bit more these days is that it's weak. And there are different reasons for worrying about weakness, but one reason we should worry about weakness is that in the Cold War, the Soviet Union was really very strong. It had a powerful ideology with an appeal that was worldwide and was strong, particularly at the beginning, even in Europe. That doesn't exist anymore. And for that reason, America has rather little to fear from Russia. So it's not that we are completely on our own, but that Russia is now much more a regional problem for us than a global problem. So America doesn't look at it in the same way, and we need to take account of that. And I'm very happy to hear that the Czech Republic is thinking of increasing defense spending, but all I would say is, please don't do it on your own. The EU spends much more on defense than Russia does. The stupidity is that everybody spends it separately. I don't want a common European army, it would be a nightmare, but I would like to have a common European rifle, that everybody buys the same equipment. So if you make new spending, say you will spend this, but only conditionally that it should be on single European products. Have a competition for a rifle, for a tank, whatever you want. And we buy one product, then we don't need to spend more. Actually, we just do that together. And and we will become. It will take time, but we will then get much better value for money. So I think that's good enough.
Ivan Gabal, I understand that you see this situation not only as a challenge for us, for Central Europe, for the European Union, but also as a možnost, possibility, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
A chance, yeah. An opportunity for us. Am I right?
Well, maybe. There are serious questions about Russia for several reasons. Russia is definitely a regional problem, but having a permanent seat in Security Council and blocking any resolution on Syria, for example, so Russian contribution to the crisis in Syria and creation of Islamic State is significant. Russian naval base in Syria is not a regional problem, just to use one argument. But the more serious question, and I have to say that Poland is changing strategic concept officially to facing current situation. They are going through the presentation and debate over it, and they are going to present it in Prague in, I think, few days. And the question is, being weaker face-to-face to current Kremlin, does it increase risk of aggressive behavior of Russia? Me being responsible for the defense of our country, I have to answer yes. How far Kremlin considers a legal base and international law as certain threat, it's a question mark. He has no hesitancy to violate it. Crimea, Eastern Ukraine, stealing people all over country. We are time to time regularly performing air policing to Baltic state, now going to Ireland, facing a really heavy military performance of Russian aircrafts. It's not a children game, I mean. It's not a question of being respective to international law. And last but not least, it could be that, I don't know, Janek Tombinsky as a EU ambassador to Kiev did have a negotiation with the Commissioner Philae. Maybe we made some errors, but is it sufficient reason to kill people by shooting and to take over by military crime? Which century we live? And last but not least, reading any domestic communication in Russia, newspapers, do feel there is a clear interest of Russia to arrive to certain cultural commonality with Europeans. They are hating hatreds, intolerance. Russian people are escaping this environment to live in Europe, and we have 40,000 of Russians in Czech Republic. And last but not least, I I know we have a lot of troubles with our own legal state, with our resistance toward corruption, with our performance in terms of European law. This is what makes us stronger and more resistant to Russian pressure. But on the other side, the activity of Russia in terms of intelligence in this region, this is nothing friendly. It's not activity of Czech external services in Russia. So maybe we did error. I don't think, and I don't see them in Maidan. I see strong determination by Ukrainians to arrive really to civilized standard. But for me, it is not sufficient reason to kill people and use heavy military to occupy neighboring country. Especially we with our history know what it means consequently.
Thank you.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you for your kind words and for support. There is such a term in German, Putin verstehe. Yeah. It's pretty popular because it's also somehow is a symptom how Russian propaganda works in Europe. It of course has absolutely different means than in Russia itself, because it's much more sophisticated, not so direct as in Russia. Usually, as you mentioned, there are two sides. Maybe we should deal with the other side. They are not just bad guys, just plus a little bit conspiracy theory. Maybe the shootings were made by the opposition or by Maidan people themselves. But actually, what we are dealing here with is, it's even very soft way to call it propaganda. It's absolutely unbelievable Hollywood-made, or rather Mosfilm-made fiction of, it's like parallel world, parallel reality, in which we are violently put inside, which was imposed on us violently. And this kind of fascistoid pathology on the international arena is cynically placed like a norm and demands from the world to be perceived like a norm. And in this fiction, it is fiction absolutely, but as we all know, it has very real and material consequences. In this fiction, Ukraine is junta and Fourth Reich. Europe is gay Europe. America is a black guy with banana, and Putin is love. And war is peace, and fascism is anti-fascism. It's really something, just we can recall really Orwell to understand this idea. But what I really mean, that politics is always about truth. It's not just playing this kind of game that we should pay attention to the other side. Sorry, but I have no such a privilege to do that. I'm pretty different situation. And when you treat politics like a truth procedure, it means that things should be named properly. And that is a task also for you in the West, at least to understand. Just don't buy this bullshit, because it is produced to do, because it has no sense. It makes no sense especially on the international level, because it's also the question of time. As you said, the war is becoming closer and closer. We don't have this privilege to waste time, and maybe you can imagine that Ukraine is still out, and they can do what they want, but still in the 21st century, in the center of Europe, there were mass murder. mass killings of people. You cannot find any country in Europe which is so enthusiastic about the European idea, which put the basic political idea of Europe, like Agora, the same like basis, the same metrics on the contemporary level. It's impossible to imagine in other country. So quoting like, or rather reformulating Habermas, I would say that Europe is an unfinished project. Yeah? It is unfinished because, first of all, because of Ukraine. So you should finish it. It's the task which is still on the table. But that is our common task somehow.
Ingo Schulze.
Nein, meine Kritik.
My criticism of the West is that in Germany we say that Ukraine in the nearest future will not become a part of the EU, and I criticize this. I think there is no other image that would give the unity of this conflict, of this unity. We see, for instance, that Snowden is safe only in Moscow. It's a shame. It's a shame for democratic state with rule of law. It's shame that the West is unable to protect someone like Edward Snowden, who have revealed a lot of the Western society. I think it's fatal that we are unable to protect him. It doesn't mean that Russia is better, therefore. No, it is just something showing us how the West really is. The annexation of Crimea is something we can't approve, of course. We cannot consent to it. But it is not an irrational decision for political scientists, because it's requirement of Ukraine being a member of NATO, and it is coming on the table again and again. And then it would mean for Russia that Crimea is lost for them, and Crimea would become an asset of NATO, and that is raising concern. And I don't think that arms races will resolve problems, or that threats would resolve problems. No, you need to do also mental disarmament to resolve the problems. Syria, Afghanistan, and other hot areas in the world will not be resolved without Russia. And it is in particular Syria where Russia, in my view, is not the bad guy. The fact that we have IS there, it is not only Russia, it's also a consequence of American invasion to Iraq. And of course, problems have a very differentiated nature, but the fact that we are now on the side of Assad, of Iran, I find very strange. So, and then tell me, how can we trust, how can we believe US when they have transported people to Syria or Russia, people they wanted to torture to squeeze out information? This is not a Hollywood conspiracy, is it?
Thank you for your comment, but also I would like to mention a fact, and I would like you to comment this. You had an honor or the privilege or the opportunity to be at Valdai Club meeting, I think 2 weeks ago, when President Vladimirovich Putin had this famous speech. So you were at the heart of darkness, let's say. So I would like you to ask to share with us your feelings about this also.
Even more, I had a dinner with Mr. Putin. But listen, this is a very important conversation, and I'm very grateful that I'm going to speak last. Because on one level, part of debate about Ukrainian crisis in Europe is very much about the United States. Most of the people who basically decides to say don't go tough on Mr. Putin are people who basically are giving arguments about the United States, because if you go policy by policy, these people are probably not going to approve neither the economic policy of the Russian state, nor its policy towards sexual minority, nor its cultural policies and others. Let's start with the obvious. Russia is a very tough place. You're not going to feel nicely living there. The level of pressure on anybody who is not sharing the view of the country is tougher than in the Soviet times, because now it's not simply from above, but it's also from below. Because Mr. Putin, it's not only propaganda, the majority of the Russian population very much supports this policy. This is the other story. This is not that you have a government which is opposed by the public opinion. This is not true. And this is why I do believe we should basically try to be very serious discussing this. Let's start one by one, coming basically also to the dinner. First, when you say this was a very successful, peaceful, uneventful 25 years, it's true for Central Europe. But if you have been living in the Balkans, 200,000 people died. Now in Ukraine, there are less than 5,000. Just imagine what we're talking about. If you go to the post-Soviet space, including Russia, by the way, do you know how many of the post-Soviet republics are controlling the borders which they are subscribed to? Not many. Azerbaijan has a border problem because of Nagorno-Karabakh. Georgia is not controlling all its territory. Moldova is not controlling. Ukraine is not controlling. So even when we say that basically this was a peaceful, not changing borders, it is true for part of Europe. And these people have a totally different experience, and this experience probably explains parts of the way they're reacting. And this is very important. Secondly, concerning our own institutions, really, I do believe we're going to be pressed not simply to increase budget deficits, but also to try to understand what is working and what is not working. Because we have an admirable institutions. From this point of view, I'm not sharing the criticism coming of the Eurosceptics, but here's the story. In Japan, and Robert Cooper knows about Japan and like me, they have the best 3G cell phones in the world. They're so good that they cannot export them. This is called the Galapagos syndrome. This is very well described in literature. They have so high standards, and this is so much based on a kind of a very strong special customers' demands that it is not exportable. And one of the problems the European Union is facing now is how exportable our model is. Can we export it to Russia or not? And this is not an abstract question, because on the basis of this you're making policies. And here I'll go to basically where I see as, go.
I just interrupt to say that's why my dream has always been to have Ukraine in the European Union, eventually, after a long time, because it needs a big fix to make it work, to have law and democracy function there. But after a time, because that is the best way in which one can influence Russia.
Yeah, exactly. But basically, our idea was always that we have a special model, which is European now, but probably this is how the future is going to look like. And here came the major kind of a challenge coming from the annexation of Crimea. We believe that economic interdependence is making the war impossible in Europe. We are still very economically interdependent with Russia, but the result of this economic interdependence was that when they decided to act, we were not in a very strong position to react. Secondly, we always were very proud how predictable we are. And to be honest, our predictability is now one of the major vulnerability in relations to Mr. Putin. Because Mr. Putin basically armed himself with unpredictability. We don't know what he will do next, but he knows what we are going to do. And I do believe all this is a major challenge in the way we operate. And here's my impression, because I went for the first time to Sochi. I was very much interested. For me, this was quite interesting environment. And basically, there are four impressions which are on a much more kind of a non-theoretical level, but which at least are important for me. There is a strong nationalistic public opinion in Russia which exists, and which is a very strong constraint on any way policy is going to be made. Mr. Putin is not as free as we believe. And I'm saying this because he now is going to serve the public opinion that he created to a certain extent through the national television and others. When some of the strong nationalistic voices were asking questions during these meetings, and these are closed meetings, there is no television, the ministers obviously were fearing these voices, and this was Putin's ministers. So this is a different Russia from this point of view. At the moment, only 14% of the Russians has a positive view of the European Union. Compare this with 2 or 3 years ago. So this is a different reality. Secondly, Mr. Putin himself, very energetic, very quick, nice sense of humor, but he does not believe that he can. He does not believe that he can make a deal with the United States. And strangely enough, in his vision of the world, two things cannot be changed. First, that America explains everything about European policies. He does not believe that there is European policies. And this is very important. Basically, this is a total preoccupation with the United States. And secondly, which is even more important, he does not believe that people can go on the streets protesting on their own. He's never going to ask question why. He's asking who. Who organized them, who paid them, who basically is behind this. And this is, this police vision of history is going to be a major problem in our relationship. Because when he goes and asks for an agreement with the West, he said, stop interfering in our domestic politics, which means promise us that there are never going to be angry people on the street. But we cannot, because we cannot do it in our own countries. In Bulgaria, we have 400,000 days people protesting. So this is this type of expectations which is going to make the negotiations very difficult. It is going to be a much more difficult negotiations than people believe. It's not only about Ukraine. I don't believe that he controls everything in eastern Ukraine. And of course, I don't believe that the Ukrainian government controls everything, basically. So saying all this, for me, Europe is in a very strange position. And here I very much agree with Robert Cooper. There is a major difference between the United States and Europe. United States has a negligible economic relations with Russia. So if you want to be hawkish in the United States, there is only one country in which you can be as tough as you want. And this is Russia. China, too important. Iran, very sensitive for different reasons. And Russia, basically, if you're American politicians, not part of the foreign policy decision-making, this is where you can play symbolic politics. This is not the case in Europe. And Mr. Putin basically is going to do his best to split Europeans. As you can see, because you talk about Central Europe and that there's going to be much more consolidation on the level of Central Europe, it's not so easy. I don't believe that Poland and Hungary looks in the same direction. This type of stories that we have been taking for granted based on history are not here anymore. And there is a certain level of attractiveness of this type of a political regime of decisionism and so on coming there. And this is my kind of last point as a result of it. There are two things that we should stop doing. One is to come with the cartoon vision of the Russian elite. These people are just very corrupt, they're only interested in money and so on. Listen, they're very corrupt, but they're not interested only in money. They're interested in historical revenge, it's about glory, it's about being part of a big country. They much more live in history than in the market. And they're also now rich enough not to be interested in money. So this idea that, second, and for me this is the most important problem, this is with the sanctions. People said sanctions does not work. My problem is that sanctions worked, but they worked in a way that does not work for us. Which means that sanctions, plus many other factors, are going to hurt Russian economy, but as a result of it, four things that we didn't want are going to happen. First, nevertheless, that Russia is going to be economically very much damaged by the sanctions. In the near future, it's not going to change Russia's foreign policy. And this is not going to change Russia's foreign policies because there is one important thing that at least I'm taking as major lessons out of the talks with Mr. Putin. He will do his best not to show weakness. Not to show weakness is going to be the major objective of the Russian foreign policy. Secondly, what is going to happen, and this is quite important, Russians are intelligent people. By the way, the level of the economic elite is really first class. It's a big country. They know that even if the sanctions are going to be lifted now, for the next 2 or 3 years, the investors are not going to jump and run to Russia. So having lifting of the sanctions as a priority does not make economic sense. Thirdly, for years, Mr. Putin wanted to cut some of the financial and cultural dependence of his own elite on Europe. He came with the legislations that Russian high officials should not have accounts in the Western banks. He was basically trying to make them less dependent on the West. Of course, the Russian elite does not trust Mr. Putin much. For them, Europe was insurance policies. They prefer to have their money, their kids, and their houses in Prague than in Moscow. But now with this confrontation, many of them are coming back. because it was not only Putin, but now our intelligence service is going after them. And what we should understand is that Russia goes in a policy of isolationism and self-isolationism. Putin, unlike the Soviet Union, is not strong enough to isolate Russia because he does not have ideology and idea of future to tell them. So he created a crisis where he needs our help to close Russia. If in 1960s, in Berlin, when the Soviets decided to cut with the West, they erected a wall. Now Mr. Putin created a situation in which the Ukrainians want to build a wall. So he outsourced closing to us. And for us this is a problem, because if the sanctions are going to stay for a while, some of the other players, India, China and others, they can see that we're using the infrastructure, global infrastructure that we control for our own purposes. And this is a very strong incentive for deglobalization. And I do believe that the European Union is going to be the major loser of deglobalization. So from this point of view, if we're going to be serious, on one level, we should try basically to contain Russia in the way what they're doing there, but we should not encourage Russia's isolationism, and we should not basically encourage Russia's getting out of the global infrastructure, because this is going to hurt us.
I think we've got about 15 minutes for comments and questions from you. Okay, please. And please introduce yourself, okay? Do you have a microphone?
Introduce yourself.
Okay, I'm Alan Miller from the New York Salon. Thank you. It's a very fascinating discussion. I was interested in Robert Cooper's suggestion that we live in a post-imperial world, well, particularly in Europe. In the context of this discussion, because it does strike me that we don't live in the classic imperialist world, but when we talk about Russia and what it thinks, I think there's a slight arrogance, it strikes me, because it is the case that America and Britain and France and Germany and what we call the West has intervened in many countries in these last 25 years, and we look at some of the consequences of those interventions and how perhaps regional issues get exacerbated and blown up into big international, very bloody events, and then we are left with situations like ISIL in Iraq, for instance. And when we see these things and we see that perhaps democratically elected people are encouraged by the West to be taken out of position, and we see that the West, both America, people like John Kerry and his advisors, and also the EU, take a very active position in areas like the Ukraine. I would be very concerned if that was on my border, and I would be very concerned that that would stoke up and activate and create problems. And I think that we need to take a slight pause when we have this discussion, because much of the discussion, particularly in Britain, but I think across parts of Western Europe and America, is that there's this mad guy called Putin who's hell-bent on creating a whole new Cold War. And we're already talking about rearming. In Germany, people are saying, perhaps you better get ready to fight over Ukraine. And I think in many ways, my question to you would be, how can we look at this so that we can deactivate some of the pressure, step away from some of that tension, and not exacerbate it?
I would like to gather two more questions, and there will be only the one round of questions. Okay, so who? Yeah, Milan Nič, please. Okay, thanks. And who will be? Okay.
Thank you very much. I'm glad that Ivan shared with us his own conclusion from the Valdai Club, because that would have been my question. But now, two short questions for everybody. Number one, what do you think about the time scale that we can think of rationally now from in 2014 about the confrontation between Putin's Russia and the West? Some people are already thinking about 2024, because this is the end of the second mandate of Vladimir Putin, and maybe he will stay longer. Is it really such a long time scale that we should be thinking about self-isolation of Russia, or how long do you expect the current trajectory, the baseline scenario, could go on? And second question, how do you evaluate the foreign policy performance of Germany in this crisis? this is perhaps the first crisis in which Germany leads Europe. Thank you.
Okay, and we've got a third question and the last one, okay? There. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm Tomasz Łoń, Polish ambassador in Slovakia. I have a question to Vasyl Cherepanin. And let me put it in a context. If I say that the integration of Ukraine to the European Union, eventually with Ukraine as member of the European Union, is the Polish foreign policy #1 priority, I wouldn't be far from the truth. But then you said that Europe is not a finished project because of Ukraine. But I'm not sure whether I understood you correctly. Whose job is now to finish this project? Is it European Union's or is it Ukrainian and Ukrainians? Thank you.
So I think we'll start with the last question, okay?
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much for the question. It's a long story, of course, because I would say that the European politics towards its eastern neighborhood was mistaken in a lot of cases, yeah, and I can generalize and call it that it's Ukraine. So maybe it was mistake not to include Ukraine from the very beginning in the processes that were typical after the crash of the Soviet Union in 1990-91. Because you know, on the one hand you have this like antagonism of the two symbolic dates, which depict the difference between so-called social world, socialist world, and post-Soviet world. Because what was achieved for the satellites of the USSR was absolutely different for the former Soviet republics, because this kind of emancipative declaration to have a free Europe, yeah, was somehow transformed. I mean, the proclamation of the 1989 movements was transformed into a fortress Europe. Fortress for those who are outside. And Ukraine was experiencing and still experience this kind of attitude. Even more after the crash of the USSR, the relevance of the borders in general, which were supposed to be overcome after 1989. After the crash of the Soviet Union, the relevance of the borders even grew. So we are living like in parallel worlds, but now, as I said, the revolution and war against Ukraine showed that it's not possible anymore to live in two worlds. It should be somehow united. It's a big question how. Of course, Ukrainian politicians are responsible too. But on the other hand, what I would like to underline is that one shouldn't evaluate Maidan only in the context of the EU integration. The refusal to sign the EU agreement by the ex-president Yanukovych was only the pretext for the protest. Yeah, it provoked the protest, but a pretty small one. Yeah. That's why it was called Euromaidan. The real Maidan, without the Euro prefix, started after the police attack on the students' Euromaidan. That was a real starting point. Only afterwards, from the 1st of December last year, the people of Ukraine began to join the protest on an unprecedented level. And it was transformed from Euromaidan into people's uprising. And not only for Europe, but rather against criminal and repressive state apparatus of Ukraine. That is the true meaning that Maidan has. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Robert Cooper?
Actually, that's a bit of the answer that I was going to give. These events were not sponsored or organized by the West. The European Union, in my view, has always been deeply ambivalent about Ukraine, unfortunately, but that's it. It's very divided, like it's divided on most other things. And there are people in the European Union who have objected to joint language in joint statements which implied that Ukraine was a European country. And the reason they do that is because the treaty says any European country can join the European Union. I mean, I find this is really a bad, stupid joke. But there's a lot of work that Ukraine has to do to join the European Union. But really what it has to do is to straighten itself out. And everybody always talks about the democratically elected Mr. Yanukovych, but actually Ukraine is a far from democratic state and has been a far from democratic state until maybe these last elections where there is a gleam of democracy. But it's been an entirely corrupted state for much of the last period. And it's really bad when not only the government is corrupt, but the opposition is corrupt too. So now there is maybe a chance, but these events were not very much to do with the outside, with how I understood it. It was, as you say, it was an attack on the corruption of Ukraine and the hope that Europe could save them. I doubt it. I think only Ukraine can save them. I hope that we will help, and I hope that you succeed. And I think you should be allowed to run the country the way that the people want. And I think they were there. So I don't see this as anything to do with imperialism. I agree with in a way there is a kind of post-imperial complacency in some ways in Europe that's not very pleasant. And one ought to understand that other people have problems too. I'm even ready to understand that that Mr. Putin has problems, because without that you don't in the end reach a resolution.
Thank you. Ivan Kastev, Ivan Gabal, and Ingo Schulz, I would like all of you for just 1 minute answer.
Just two things. One is about the time perspective, which come from Milan. This is even more tricky than this. We don't know how post-Putin's Russia is going to look like. And it can be even more dangerous than Putin's Russia. 2 years ago, before any annexation of Crimea and others, there was a transatlantic trends survey that had been done about the foreign policy perspectives of different societies. So I decided to see what's going to be the Russia's foreign policy if only people who declare that they are in opposition to Mr. Putin, around 20% of the population, are going to vote and to decide. And this anti-Putin Russia was even more anti-Western. So from this point of view, I do believe one of the things that we should not do is extrapolate things that we know from places like Serbia and others and believe that this is what's going to happen. We are trying to understand how Putin's Russia looks like. Post-Putin Russia could be very also kind of problematic, because one of the weakest points of the current regime is that there is no succession mechanism. You don't know. There is no elections. Mr. Putin is not a Tsar, and if he is a Tsar, he does not have a son. And certainly there is not a party like the Communist Party of China that can basically decide on the next leader. And this makes the situation extremely uncertain, and in a certain way, this is part of where the tensions come from. So when we talk about next Russia, I do believe we should work with more than one scenario. Because one of the things that Putin really feared, and this, at least in my interpretation, was one of the reasons he went on annexation of Crimea, not on controlling Crimea, which is different. He could have made a frozen conflict, we are going to have a different conversation. But annexation of Crimea was that he feared that losing Ukraine, losing Kiev to Maidan, was going basically to change the political situation in Moscow, and the nationalistic opposition is going to turn against him. And this is what he really fears. It's not the liberal groups in Moscow, in my view, that he fears.
A few words to this timing, because I would consider it as the most important question. Shall we see the long-term crisis or short-term? what I would consider the most risky period is a period before new US president is elected, and I expect heavy military testing of the Western ability and an effort to weaken further US interest in Europe and to disunite European Union by all means. So this is next 2 years and 2 months. Yes. And but what can be a longer perspective is due to this internal change in atmosphere and attitudes inside the Russian society as far as attitudes toward us, and we should see its attitude toward us. And last but not least, we observe increasing effort of Russian middle class to withdraw their money from Russia. So the impact of economic sanction is influencing heavily private money, savings, value, etc. So we can expect, and this is where I would see another factor contributing to the tough domestic atmosphere in Russia, a really significant impact of economic sanction. However, it should be said that if we want to protect international law and our legal system, and if we don't want to go to war, you have no other option than economic sanction and diplomatic effort.
Thank you. And Ingo Schulze, please.
The question concerning the role of German foreign policy is maybe not the right question for me, but in the last 3-4 years I've been confronted with this issue quite often, and the question is whether Germany now tries to achieve a goal with the help of euro it failed to achieve before with the armed forces. And I deal with this question, and Germany has historic memory and experience. We still have many Germans alive, Germans who fought in the Ukraine. And here we need a high level of responsibility, and we should be also playing the role of a bridge. And I hope that we will be able to come with ideas that will open the road from Lisbon to Novosibirsk. And I think that is the only alternative. There is nothing better. We cannot afford to end up in a situation of a vicious circle. We speak of the self-determination of Ukraine, but it is also an issue concerning both parties. Both parties have to be open and must say what they want. And it is in the interest of all of us to open this space, to open from Lisbon to Vladivostok. And
so I will not comment all these interesting issues that were raised during our conversation. I think it was just a starter, a first part of a 3 days long Central European Forum in Bratislava, and I think it's very promising. You will not go out from this theater for 3 days. And the second panel we just start in, I don't know, 15 minutes or half an hour maybe. So we really have to close. We really have to finish it now. But I think this, it was really great to see all of you listening so carefully to our speakers, and I would like to thank all of you for your participation in this really European debate. Thank you a lot. Thank you very much.